Today, I'm gonna tell you about the biggest prank in the history of my country. This prank was so crazy that the head of the parliament went to the national TV station and tried to shut it down. So this is when a bunch of students were able to convince the entire country that there was an emergency in the nuclear power plant. Things got so bad that people started drinking iodine to counteract the radiation that they thought they were getting from the nuclear emergency. To understand how this happened and how was this even possible, we have to go back to the 90s. So in 1989, the socialist regime in Bulgaria collapsed. Now this meant that Bulgaria will transition to democracy, which happened over the 90s. However, the 90s were incredibly unpredictable time. It was chaos and corruption and all sorts of bad stuff was happening in the 90s, not just in Bulgaria, but also in the entire former socialist bloc, okay? So because this was such an unpredictable and crazy time, basically people were writing the rules as they were going. That meant that there was very little control and very little supervision over what was allowed to happen and what was not allowed to happen. And this was actually the perfect time for this comedy program called Cuckoo. Cuckoo was a comedy TV show made by students that aired on Bulgarian national television from 1990 to 1994. It's named after the sound of a cuckoo bird, but it's also a colloquialism for someone crazy. It was hosted by a puppet named Mr. Cuckoo. It aired every 2 weeks and included reports and interviews that commented on current events. It used humor, irony, and grotesque exaggeration to illustrate the Bulgarian society, which had just entered democracy and freedom of expression. Cuckoo was practically the first free and daring TV show to broadcast on national television. Through the voices of students, viewers were exposed to long-held and unspoken truths, opinions, and perspectives. The show consisted of sketches, satirical clips, and reports made by actors and reporters. So this brings us to December 22nd, 1991. This was a Sunday afternoon where a lot of Bulgarians were sitting in front of their TV sets to watch an episode of Cuckoo. However, as the show was going, suddenly it would be interrupted by an emergency news broadcast. Dear viewers, we apologize for interrupting the student program Cuckoo. The previously announced program has been cancelled. We are expecting an address by the President of the Republic. Now you gotta understand that back then, back in the 90s, and especially during socialist time, this was not normal. This was actually very, very unusual to happen. So immediately people realized that something very bad was going on. What they saw was a guy named Dmitry Tsonev, who was the actual host of the news. He introduced a lieutenant colonel from the headquarters of civil defense. This guy, this lieutenant colonel, who by the way is an actual lieutenant colonel from the army, he started explaining how the population is not well prepared for a nuclear emergency. And then, out of nowhere, they start playing an old public announcement movie that warns people what to do in case of a nuclear emergency. Now you gotta understand, at this point, they're not saying that anything has happened. They're not saying flat out right that there's been a nuclear emergency. They're just saying, hey, you know, in case there was a nuclear emergency, what should we do? Now, this might sound very strange to you, but you gotta understand that back then, people were used to not being told information directly. Because they've been part of a dictatorship for almost 50 years, people have learned to read between the lines and to hear things that haven't been said. So yeah, you can see here that this movie is totally innocent. It's just a simple movie where they're explaining, okay, in case of a nuclear emergency, you gotta pack your bags and leave and whatnot.
Go home immediately. Perform hermetization of the predetermined accommodation premises and remain inside. Put on gas masks and prepare your personal belongings and automobile for evacuation.
But people were so freaked out to hear this because it was just like, why are you telling us that? Should we be worried? Has something happened? Kozloduy nuclear power plant, named after the nearby town, is located in the north of Bulgaria on the shore of the Danube River. It is the largest power plant and only nuclear power plant in the country. It started operating on September 4, 1971, and it was gradually expanded to 6 reactors. After the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, there were serious concerns about the safety of the nuclear energy and especially of the Russian reactors. several European countries, such as Germany, Italy, and Switzerland, decided to shut down their nuclear facilities. In 1991, the International Atomic Energy Agency released a report stating that the Kozloduy nuclear power plant is in a poor state. And then the host announced that both the Council of Ministers and the National Assembly are in an emergency session. Now you gotta understand that these are the two highest government bodies in Bulgaria. The Council of Ministers is the highest executive power, and the National Assembly is the highest legislative power. So the fact that they were in session on a Sunday afternoon meant that something very serious was happening. And then they play footage from real reporters that are usually reporting on political news that say that the National Assembly and the Council of Ministers are in session. Then they play an interview with a nuclear expert. And while all this is going, in between all these segments, they're playing the so-called on-air reserve. Now, the on-air reserve is footage that is specifically there to be played when an emergency is happening. You might have heard that in Russia, they play the Swan Lake when the leader of the country passes away, right? So this is kind of like a meme. I want to hear the Swan Lake. Well, Bulgaria was also doing something similar. Whenever an emergency is happening, they would play a concert by Tina Turner. And the people who are in power, they know that. This isn't known by the public, but the people who are in charge of the country, they know that if they see a Tina Turner concert that hasn't been scheduled or anything, then something really, really bad has happened. Now the people, even though they haven't been told anything directly, they begin to panic. You gotta remember that this was only 5 years after the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe, which by the way was covered up by the Bulgarian authority. So a lot of people did get radiation poisoning here in Bulgaria. That's why a lot of people started duct taping their doors and windows and to drink iodine, which helps with radiation poisoning. Meanwhile, as all of this is happening, there's a crowd of people that gathers in front of the national television that demand an explanation. They want to know what's actually going on. The head of the Bulgarian parliament, now this guy was watching TV and suddenly he hears all this stuff and he freaks out. He goes to the national television and he demands to shut down the broadcast. He actually goes and he says, "How do I switch off the TV?" Yeah, this has actually happened. The head of the National Assembly went to the national television and was like, "How do I turn it off? Like, I want to turn off this broadcast." So as you can see, tension escalates, everything is getting worse and worse, but no one dares to shut down the program, okay? And this is, by the way, not a live broadcast. This is all being prepared in advance. Suddenly, there's an announcement that the president of Bulgaria will make a statement. However, instead of the president, people were greeted by the host of the comedy program Cuckoo that was supposedly interrupted by the emergency broadcast. The host, Mr. Cuckoo, who as you can see is a puppet, admits that the whole thing was a prank and none of this was real. Then he invites the editor-in-chief of Cuckoo to read a statement. Dear viewers, as you have already understood, everything you have seen is a joke. The information presented over the last 50 minutes is a blatant lie. What you saw never happened. I hope it never happens. But if any of you are genuinely scared, I'm glad. I'm glad not because we've caused fear. I'm glad because you believed us. What we value the most is your trust. So yeah, as you can imagine, this was absolutely insane. Ironically, because at the time television was the only source of information. I mean, yeah, there was radio and newspapers, but you gotta understand there was no internet. So television was both highly trusted and at the same time everyone knew that it was lying all of the time. People were used to read between the lines, so they instinctually realized that something bad must have happened. The irony is that the prank was so successful that very few people paid attention to the point the creators were making. Their intent was to show the power of national television and to highlight the need for alternative voices in the face of real threats. In interviews decades later, the crew admits that they never expected the public to believe them as much as they did. They say that they thought that everyone would find the whole thing ridiculous and were surprised that so many people fell for the hoax. There was a trial later, but they couldn't prove anything because the show never says anything directly. It's all insinuated, so they got off free. And by the way, in a typical Cuckoo fashion, they made a mockery of the trial. They got dressed up and they're performing in front of the courthouse for people to enjoy. Okay guys, that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.